Somebody just told me that we should not have ordinary women. It should say extra in front of it. Extraordinary women. That's okay, that's okay. I thought I would come out here. So how are you doing? It's a serious question. How are you doing? This is the question that my wife asked me on a fairly regular basis. Like we'd be walking, or we'd just be sitting minding my own business. And she'll say, how do you think we're doing? Yeah, I do also ask that question from time to time, but I try to pick my time very wisely. How do you think we're doing? Well, how do you think we're doing? This current emphasis on living in the gap, is that okay with you? By the way, I want to publicly thank my daughter for babysitting me through the process of buying a new car. Thank you. I followed your advice and I got the deal of a lifetime. I'm serious. If you want a tough negotiator, see Sabrina. So it's going okay, huh? So, did he get it out about Phyllis's service? 1 o'clock this afternoon at the Dietling Funeral Home on Memorial and Gessner. I think it's on Memorial and Kirkwood. It's way out there. Detling. I've been saying Dietling. Well, it's still the same place. Okay, I want to, I don't know if you went to Big Church today, but I had an idea that the closing hymn that we sang today would be good to sing at a funeral service for a couple that had been married a long time. The battle's over. The strife is well, I couldn't hardly give you a straight face. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. So I'm calling this talk today, Comfortable with Uncertainty. The fact that we are living in the midst of this huge paradigm shift that I'm trying to speak to both in religious language and spiritual language is something that makes us all feel threatened and insecure. I think in some areas we can find change invigorating or exciting, especially in the areas, however, where we have fixed ideas, where we have strongly held beliefs. Change can be tough. Now, I am fairly certain that the predictions that are being made about the future of the Christian movement are correct. And that is that without major changes, the future of the Christian movement as you and I know it is very bleak. Now, we don't pick that up in this geographical area so much because we live in the buckle of the Bible Belt. But outside of this geographical area, it's felt keenly 4,000 churches a year close their doors in the United States. So we're declining membership. What I can't do is tell you, nor can anyone else, what the future's like. The reactions to the paradigm shift that we are experiencing are profound. The ambiguity about the future is troubling. So the question that came to me was, how can we live comfortably in the midst of this? How can we be comfortable with uncertainty? Now, I want to confess that the title is not original with me. I got it from this woman. This woman is Pema Chodron. Pema Chodron is probably one of the most beloved Buddhist nuns by Buddhists and others all over the world. She was the first American nun. She was abbot, or what do you call abbotess or whatever, of Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, which is the first Buddhist monastery in North America. And in addition to writing a book called Comfortable with Uncertainty, she has a gift, in my opinion, with coming up with great titles for books. She has a book called The Places That Scare You. It's a great book. She has another book called When Things Fall Apart. Both of those are great titles. And if you do a search on Google for Pema Chodron quotes, you will find some really great ones. For example, let difficulty transform you. And it will. In my experience, we just need a little help in learning how not to run away. One of my, as you know, if you get here ahead of time, or even in these talks, you know that one of my favorite things is cartoons. I love cartoons from all sources, from all over, of all kinds. And one of my favorite cartoons is drawn by Wiley Miller, and it's called Non Sequitur. And Non Sequitur appears sometimes as a single standalone panel. And then sometimes it will be a panel or two that really make up a longer panel that appear over maybe a week-long period of time. So I want to show you one that I think captures the truth of the psycho-spiritual journey. One of the characters, a little girl, has gotten all caught up, as some children do, in this desire to grow up. I want to grow up, be older than she is. And like Alice in Wonderland, I'm not showing you this part, she has fallen down a rabbit hole where she encounters a long corridor with doors that have different numbers on them. These doors represent the different ages that we can become, but she doesn't know this at the time. And she also encounters her guide, though she doesn't know that either. And so they go for a long way until they finally reach the edge of a cliff. And this is where we pick up the story. And she says to the guide, "What's this scary looking thing?" And the guide says, "It's the road to serenity. There are plenty of easier, mundane roads in life, but only this one will lead you to true contentment of the soul. It's the leap of faith that stops most people. So, how are you supposed to see your way?" And the guide says, "By following your bliss." And she says, "I don't think I'm ready for this." And the guide says, "Yes, I know, dear. Sometimes all we need is a little push." "But wait, what?" And the guy says, "Bye for now, dear. Just remember, it's never too early to start following our bliss, but we don't need to be in a rush to grow up." So off she goes, whoop. And in the last panel, it says, "Wait, did she say hour? And we, and she arrives at blissfulness. I would say she arrives at ordinary life. It's a wonderful tale. I mean, this tale really is so full of truth. We have to take the risk into falling into the unknown. Sometimes we need a little push. Usually life accommodates. One of the first things George, my teacher, said to me was, my job is to push you off the path. Your job is to get back on. And that's where growth happens. That's where learning occurs, where we get back on. Lots of things push people off the path. We read about them every day in the paper. We see them in the news. Power, greed, envy, sex, money, drugs. Other things can do it. Joseph Campbell is the one who came up with the phrase, follow your bliss. And it's a very misunderstood phrase. Campbell didn't mean do what makes you happy. What Campbell meant by follow your bliss was do what is your unique contribution to make to the evolutionary journey. Our job is to find that out and to make that contribution. And we never think we're ready for this undertaking. It's never too soon to start. And once we get in the river, we don't have to push it. If we're open to see, there's always a sacred presence with us. And after enlightenment, as the Buddhists say, the laundry. So here's another Pema Chodron quote that is very to the point of this talk today. When we resist change, it's called suffering. But when we completely let go and not struggle against it, when we can embrace the groundlessness of our situation and relax into its dynamic quality, that's called enlightenment. Pema Chodron's writings are full of this kind of commentary. I think she may be, when Bill Moyers had his show, I think she may have been one of his favorite guests to have on. And maybe if you Google on YouTube or someplace Bill Moyers and Pema Chodron, you can see one of those interviews with her. Isn't it such an exciting thing that we live in a world where all this is just available at our fingertips? You can just go find it. The Buddhists are masters of this kind of thinking because though you will find this in all aspects of the living religious traditions and wisdom traditions, Buddhism is virtually founded on the notion that nothing lasts, that things are always coming into existence and passing out of existence. And this is true not only of our circumstances, but this is true of us. Have a nice day. Okay. Not only did I get the title of this talk from her, but I found out in doing my own research that I've used this title twice before. I used it in March of 2003 and in February of 2004. And I went back and read those talks that I gave. And I thought, who is this guy who wrote this stuff? That was a long time ago. It's changed a lot since then. But so I just wanted you not to worry. You are not getting a regurgitated form of one of those talks. And I want you to notice that the title is not getting rid of uncertainty. It's being comfortable with uncertainty. Our religious practices and spiritual faith should be designed to empower us to live into whatever future we have, not with wariness, but with trust, and with lives marked by humility, authenticity, responsibility, and service. And it's this paragraph that I want to expand on in this talk. Now, last week we talked about the fact that doing psychospiritual work is just that, it's work. And that we should not expect it not to be. It's not exotic. It's not otherworldly. Some people hear about spirituality or having a spiritual practice and they think it's incense and vapors and all that sort of stuff, and it isn't. It's first of all developing the mental discipline simply to stay, to be present and to stay, to be open to whatever is going on. Maybe to be open to having an entirely different worldview. I likened it last week to moving to a different country that requires different language, different customs, different neighbors, and it can involve the disappointment or disillusionment that comes with leaving a once former position and moving into another one. So I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios that fit the religious Christian context that I'm in and trying to speak to. So suppose you have a little, maybe a lot, of church-going experience. Maybe you went to Sunday school as a child. You know about the collection of writings that we call the New Testament. You've heard it read from in church services, followed by the phrase, the Word of God, or the Word of the Lord. We also thanks be to God. Maybe you've got no church experience. But it is virtually impossible to live in this culture without knowing about the Bible. You can't stay in a hotel room without encountering a Bible. If you go snooping through the doors like I do, you know, they're in the Gideons and put a Bible there. And unless you've taken a course on New Testament studies, or unless you have read a book about the Bible, like by someone like Marcus Borg or John Shelby Spong, or unless you've heard someone like me speak, the likelihood is that when you hear something read from the Bible, that your mental reflex, and it's one based just on how we think about other books, especially those that are presented to us as factual, as history, that what you hear falls in your mind into the category of something like a news report. And you get a choice of either thinking, well, that's not true, that couldn't have happened, and dismiss it, or taking it as being a news report. Those are kind of the ways that we think. Then, maybe, because of somebody like me, or reading Borg, or Spong, or Crossan, or something, you begin to have a different point of view. You begin to open up to another way of thinking about these writings and a different way of thinking about the Bible. And you begin to see that shortly after Jesus was executed, some guy named Mark did not sit down and write a story about Jesus. That didn't happen. Mark, I picked Mark because Mark is the first of the four narratives that we have in the Christian collection out of the hundreds that were available. And it's also the shortest. The fact is that this writing called Mark was the product of several decades of stories, collecting stories that were in circulation among the early Jewish followers of Jesus. Not only that, but these stories and the telling of them and the order in which they are told are the result of their having been marinated in Jewish liturgy for decades. Now, if it would be helpful, you can let me know, and I will go back and do a talk on this. But, somebody was talking to me the other day about why do we follow a lectionary in church? And I follow a year, Christian year, liturgical year. Because our Jewish ancestors did. They had a lectionary of sorts. They followed a year. They celebrated various festivals during the year. The followers of Jesus, being Jewish, went back into the synagogue and they shaped the story of the telling of Jesus to fit the Jewish liturgical year. Just take my word for this. I'm not going to elaborate on that now, but just take my word for this, that this is true. Mark only covers 6 months of the Jewish year. Like really, the Christian liturgical calendar is really 6 months. Now we've fleshed it out, but the liturgical calendar begins the first Sunday in Advent. That's the beginning of the Christian year. And it is over the Sunday after Pentecost with Christ the King Sunday. And the other Sundays are kind of up for grabs. And they stuck various saints in on various days to flesh out the year. But it's really that 6 month period from birth to resurrection and the founding of the church. Well, the Jews had a similar liturgical calendar, and the followers of Jesus worked their material into that liturgical calendar. It's very fascinating. I'm going to get into later what it means to claim that the writings of the Bible are divinely inspired. But the notion that God had an angel dictate what to write down is a pious legend that never happened. Although this is what evangelical Christians believe. In the pages of what we refer to as the Old Testament, there are stories that go back as far as 3,000 years. And for generations, these stories were not written down at all, but rather they were passed on in an oral tradition. That's the way the Jews told their story. That's the way all people told their stories at that time. Because they were trying to figure out who they were, where they'd been, how they got there, what to do next, and what their calling was. And as I illustrated last week, and you can go back and listen to that talk or read it, their thinking evolved over a period of time. Their thinking evolved, for example, from thinking that God motivated some of what they did to a couple of hundred years after that, looking at the same event and saying God would not motivate that kind of behavior. It must have come from Satan. All right? So they evolved in their thinking. The notion of facts and precision, for example, in reporting how old someone was, that didn't have the same meaning in the Hebrew Jewish culture as it has for us. As a matter of fact, when I studied Hebrew in the seminary, which has been so important to me later, Hebrew doesn't have the capacity for quantifying things. They can't be precise in mathematics in Hebrew. So when the storyteller wanted to indicate that someone lived a really long time, he said Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and he died. So the stories, the instructions, the laws that were written in Hebrew scriptures were shaped and changed depending on who the storyteller was, what the period of history was, and the group that was being addressed. And those stories, those instructions, those laws were not written with gays and lesbians in the United States being taken into consideration. That's an application that was made later. Same thing is true with Christian writings. The early followers of Jesus, taking their cue from Jesus who told parables, they told parables about Jesus. That was just the way the culture worked. They weren't reporting factual matters, and besides, these parables were told 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years after the fact. Now, I don't know about your storytelling ability. I just know my own. So that by the time each of these developing narratives had come into existence, each had its own bias, different point of view about who Jesus was, about what he did. And this is why the 4 narratives we have, out of the many we could have had, are so different from each other. The fact is that the way these sometimes very different stories have been told over the centuries has successfully masked this difference. There's no malicious intent behind this. The fact is, however, that some of the stories that Christian people, including me, cherish the most, these would be the birth stories, what we call the Christmas stories, and the passion narratives. They get squished together into one telling of how it was. But if you separate them out, how Mark tells it, and how Matthew tells it, and how Luke tells it, and how John tells it, there are differences that you cannot reconcile. Now, the reactions to what I just said on the part of some people are incredibly varied. Some people will hear something like this, and they will say, wow, tell me more. I didn't know that. And this is my reaction when I first heard Marcus Borg and read his writing. When I first started reading Shelby Spong, either of those I would highly recommend to you. Other people are not so sure. They hear this and they want to hang on to an interpretation or a view of the Bible they were given when they were children, in spite of the fact that biblical scholarship for well over 200 years says this isn't the way it was. But people want to hang on to it. Now, I think there are many reasons for this. The older, more familiar ways bring people comfort. They've been reciting the same creeds for decades, singing the same hymns, reading the same prayers, and they really don't stop to think about the meaning of them. They just kind of go into automatic pilot, and they enjoy the habit of communal worship that involves these things. I don't fault anyone, including myself, for doing that. But there are a lot of people who are not aware of what they're doing. They're not aware that they're not reciting literal facts. They're not aware that this is a poetic way of understanding something. They take it that this is the truth. I think this is one of the reasons that you can account for high attendance on religious days like Easter and Christmas. People love the feel-good quality of those services. You know, they like hearing that Jesus was born a special Savior of a virgin, that he came back to life on Easter Sunday after having been executed. And messing with any of that makes many people very uncomfortable. We're trying to be comfortable with uncertainty. That's why people who are new to ordinary life, or some who are not, will frequently say things like, do they know what you're teaching? And I want to be clear. I've done this before, but I want to be clear. I am teaching nothing that is not accepted in and among the highest regarded biblical scholars and Jesus scholars on the planet. It's just new to church people. So one of the battles that's going on in all major denominations right now, but it's about to flare up in the Methodist Church, is those who are defenders of the faith. They need to defend the faith. And I just want to be clear that I am not a defender of the faith. Faith in the reality of what is does not need to be defended. We don't need to defend the truth. Nor do we have to defend the values of peace, love, joy, and patience, or that of being non-judgmental. So, as you know, I've given the title to the theme I'm in, Living in the Gap Between the No Longer and the Not Yet. And though I pointed out at the beginning that this is always the truth for us, we always live between the last moment and the next, between the last breath and the next. Ours is an unprecedented time. When it comes to the digital revolution alone, this is true. I love words and do a lot of work, play with words. Think about this. The word landline is a new word in our generation. We had no need for landline before there were cell phones. Just like we had no need to distinguish between desktop computer and laptop computer. That's new in our language. I want to read you a quote by Thomas Berry, another one by Wendell Berry before we're done today. I first heard Berry quoted in the writings of Ilia Delio, and then in the writings of Richard Rohr, and now he just seems to pop up everywhere. Thomas Berry was a priest. He was an eco-theologian. He lived from 1914 to 2009. And here's the quote. It's all a question of story. We're in trouble just now because we are in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, sustained us for a long time. It shaped our emotional attitudes, provided us with life purpose, energized action, consecrated suffering, integrated knowledge, guided education. We awoke in the morning and knew who we were. We could answer the questions of our children. We could identify crime, punish transgressors. Everything was taken care of because the story was there. But now, that story is no longer functioning. And we have not yet learned the new story. Precisely. And this causes discomfort. Not to know, that is, not to have embraced the new story in the way we had embraced the old story is disorienting. As a matter of fact, I was thinking when I read Berry, we didn't have to embrace the old story. It just came. We just got it with our mother's milk. It was just how we grew up. The world was different then. I think Michael Dowd, who is going to speak here in November, makes a helpful distinction between what he calls flat earth faith and evolutionary faith. Now, when Dowd talks about flat earth faith, he is not talking about people who believe the earth is flat. Okay? However, I went online to look up the Flat Earth Society. And this is their logo. And they have a list of frequently asked questions, FAQs. And the first one is this a joke? And the answer is no. And if you want to risk breaking your chin bone when your mouth drops open, I encourage you to visit their website. Now, what Dowd means by flat earth faith is any perspective in which the metaphors and theology still in use came into being at a time when people really did believe the world was flat. Well, folks, that involves a lot of stuff. All 5 of the 5 fundamentals of fundamentalism reflect a flat earth faith, because they all 5 came into being when people really thought the earth was flat. And the main doctrines of fundamentalism, the main doctrines of evangelical Christianity, have not changed since the time of Copernicus. Now, this, of course, applies to religions other than Christianity. I think it affects the understanding of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism as well. But I'm just limiting my remarks to the practice in evangelical or fundamentalist Christianity that treats the Bible as if it were a scientific textbook, or a doctrine of interpretations that developed during this flat earth worldview. This is not limited to Christian fundamentalism, but most Christian churches, ours included, either recite the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed in their worship. And both of these creeds were written in a flat in a time of flat earth faith. So you can't take it literally. Jesus descended into hell, which we don't say in the Methodist Church. We're too nice. There is a complicated reason the Methodists don't say that, but I won't go into that. And then he ascended into heaven, as if the heaven were up there somewhere. Now, at some point, I promise, because several of you have asked me about this, to talk about how it's possible to continue to worship in a liturgy that grows out of a flat world earth view. But I just want to say here that such liturgies don't reflect the growing understanding we have of the cosmos. And I think that's one of the reasons that church attendance is going down. What's worse, in my opinion, is that if people attend a flat earth liturgy, that worship has a huge cognitive dissonance with the culture, and at worst, it contributes to the illusion that religion really doesn't have anything to do with the world out there. Religion and politics don't mix, which is about as big a getting it wrong as you can get when it comes to the teaching of Jesus. Now, it's always easier to see this in someone else's religion than it is in our own. So look at the misunderstanding of Islam by young men who live in a sexually repressed culture, but who are promised that if they martyr themselves for the cause of Allah, which in this case is a commitment to anything that even hints of evolutionary consciousness, that they will have an abundance of sexual pleasure on the other side of death. A theology that teaches or assumes that what matters most is the past, or assumes that what matters most is something that happens after we die, is not able to support an ethic that teaches that all people on the planet are members of the same human family. As Jesus clearly taught, to be the neighbor we love is not a workable theology in a flat earth worldview. So see if this makes sense to you. I'll say that what I just said in another way. If we hang on to a notion that God is off out there somewhere, not really present, unless we can cajole God to be present. And further, if we hold it that we ourselves are created in the image of this God, then it is easy for us to be outside of things and people as well. We will see the world devoid of the sacred and therefore not entitled to worthy ethical consideration. One thing that can help us be comfortable with uncertainty is to do the spiritual work required to develop the faith and trust that there is no one that is not and who are not sacred. That's the nature of the cosmos in which we live. This is the gift of evolution to us. The other thing we can do to be comfortable with uncertainty is to grow in knowing that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certitude. Now, I'm certain of that. Now, this involves moving from this flat earth faith to an evolutionary faith. And I want to begin by saying that the faith required to be comfortable with uncertainty is not hard to find. It's just hard to keep from running from. Many years ago, 25 years ago or so, I was found by a prayer by this guy, Thomas Murphy. And it's a strange thing. In the book where I found this prayer, this had to be 20, 25 years ago, the prayer was not credited And it took me a long time to find out that Merton wrote this prayer that I want to read to you. And I have made reading this prayer part of my daily practice. I read this prayer every single day that I get up out of bed. And you can make it part of your practice too. And what it shows is that the spiritual giants, in whatever tradition, are marked by a quality of humility. They don't know. And that humility is about as far removed from the arrogance we see in our culture at every turn as you can imagine. The great saints are not certain. They want to follow the truth. They hope they are following the truth. But they're not sure. Here's Merton. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you, and I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire, and I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Isn't that beautiful? So the word that the Buddha used for the practice that leads to mindful living, and mindful living is a word that you could use for evolutionary faith, being mindful, it's not esoteric, as I said, it's not spooky, it's just being present and being mindful, being open to what is. The word that the Buddha used for that is a word that he took from farming. And the word that he used for meditate or for practice was cultivate. Like a farmer cultivates the ground in which seed will be planted, hoping for a harvest. That's what we can do. We can cultivate the ground and hope for the seed. We can cultivate the ground by the way we interact with each other and hope for growth. Flat Earth religion is full of certain answers about what to do. Evolutionary faith isn't. Flat Earth religion is about a private faith. I have the truth. Evolutionary faith is public. It's based about what your experience is. What do you know? What have you seen? Where are you learning? It's based on evidence. It's based on reality. And it is comfortable with knowing that there's nothing you can do to be. Now, I've thought long and hard about explaining what I just said. And here's my best effort at the moment. There is nothing you can do to be, but if you're in the process of being, you will notice that there are other people who are in the process of being that are doing certain things. Those things will likely be useful for you to do. Though there is no guarantee that doing them will give you the same outcome that some other person who does these things attains, because doing these things came into their practice out of their being and not in order to be. Now, if you understood that, and it will be in the summary that goes out, you'll do those things. And you will do them in order to discover your own. And what you will end up getting is this wonderful gift called yourself. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo, so watch your step, and I will see you here next week.